This podcast is sponsored by Salesforce.org. Salesforce.org is the dedicated team at Salesforce that delivers technology to non-profits, educational institutions, and philanthropic organisations so they can connect with others and do more good. Salesforce.org empowers higher education with Education Cloud, a set of integrated solutions built on the world's #1 CRM, developed for the specific needs of the industry and in close collaboration with the community it represents. From building brand awareness, transforming the applicant experience, enhancing student services, building lifelong alumni relationships, or managing change and optimizing technology across the campus, Education Cloud supports institutions to drive student success and institutional success at scale. Learn how institutions are paving the way for the future of higher education and driving all kinds of innovations with Education Cloud by visiting the website salesforce.org/higher-ed and exploring the higher education customer stories. Hello everyone and welcome to The Edge, supported by Salesforce.org. This series is all about new ways of doing things in higher education leadership. We'd love to hear from you. Tweet us using the hashtag Edtech podcast. This week's episode is all about data. We're in a live discussion with university leaders covering the role of data in teaching, research and student support. We look at how data can be an impetus to positive change, what data black spots to avoid, and how to make sure that you are asking the right questions to get the best from data. Okay, here we go. Brilliant. So we're at Times Higher Education Live at Tower Bridge. And I'm delighted to be joined by many talented guests to talk about the data-led university. This podcast follows a panel discussion on the same topic, and we hope that this behind-the-scenes recording gives a chance to capture all those I wish I said moments. So without further ado, let's meet our guests. So just to kick off, perhaps we could have a quick introduction of who you are and what you do.
Hi, Camille Cantico-Howson. I'm Associate Professor of Education at Imperial College London.
Fantastic.
Good afternoon, Jane Armstrong. I'm a Senior Director for Higher Education Industry Solutions for Europe, Middle East and Africa at Salesforce.org.
Thank you, Jane.
I'm Simon Baker. I'm the Data Editor at Times Higher Education.
Thank you very much. First question, what were the highlights of today's panel? So we've just had this whirlwind discussion. If you were to walk out of this room, what were the points that would stick with you afterwards?
I think the overall feeling I get from it is that we need to stay in control of data, right, and not let it overwhelm us in terms of universities, maybe society more generally. We need to make sure that we know what it's for, what we're doing with it, who we're trying to help, whether that's students, researchers, the university's mission, and make sure that we ask the right questions about what that data is for before we start looking at the data and collecting it. It's being collected all the time. But but really to think about quite carefully what we're trying to do with that data. And that probably goes not just at the university level, but also for the government, for the regulators, because a lot of the time they're the ones kind of pushing universities, we need this. And if they can kind of frame those questions right, it will help universities.
I love David's point about the government perhaps conflating cost and value and the two being quite different. So that was one of my favourite takeaways.
Yeah, I kind of had two. One was the consensus that we had coming from a variety of different positions and thinking about it, whether it was about students or research or the sector overall. That actually the same issues come up at all of those levels around, ethics and quality and purpose and value, which I thought was really interesting. And the other point I thought was universities need to be a bit more proactive about collecting the data that they think is important for what they think they are doing. And this probably wouldn't be the same data across the sector, but how do universities get a bit more clever about the data that is relevant to the mission that they have?
And I loved your point, because I think you talked about, universities aren't, one offering, they're many offerings. And then as a result, here it's set in the UK, perhaps it's more consumer focused. So what employability, what are our starting salaries? Whereas elsewhere it's more about morals or civic duty, there's a different flavour to the data that should reflect what our social or university ambitions are anyway.
Yeah, I think there's a big gap, and I think actually there's a lot of universities that really have that civic mission, but they don't necessarily have the data to back it up. So they're at the stage where they've got the vision and they've got the values and they've got the intention, but they don't necessarily have data to evidence that success. But I think that's something that the sector could work together and come up with. How do we start to account for those kinds of things that the sector does value?
Just continuing on that point is how there's such an opportunity, no matter what angle you're looking at this, right? I mean, how do we all come together to solve this challenge, right? And everybody's looking at this data, and yes, you've got to think about, how do you harness it also overall? How do you use it and really unlock it across the campus? I mean, Camilla, you and I were even talking about that, and I know I spoke about this, but still, how it still is across all different areas. And even Paul from HESA talked about this. It's not even across the institution, but in general, right? And how do you really think about using that moving forward?
So getting rid of those silos and the little pockets of data but also it's very valuable data, isn't it? So then you have to really trust the person that you're going to share that with. So that's perhaps why sometimes it gets sort of ferreted away a little bit.
I think that point of trust is really interesting. And I think what you do with the data, I think we run into this in some of the key data that's used within institutions around teaching, like module evaluations. What is it used for? Is it used for teachers to improve and enhance their own teaching, or is it used for promotions? And we know, from large-scale studies that it's very biased data, against women and ethnic minorities, as well as the subject you're teaching. So it's really tricky to use that data for certain purposes, even though it might be really powerful data to use for enhancement purposes.
And you made that point about, actually needing to reskill if you're talking about teaching and learning. So we get all this data analytics in the back of online teaching modules, but, that will then inform how people perhaps rearrange their curriculum or enhance certain parts of it. But that professional development piece is perhaps a bit missing still.
Yeah, right now those are kind of like three separate jobs. Yes. You have the person doing the, kind of collecting the data, someone kind of doing the analytics, and someone else doing the teaching. And even if those people are part of a team, it's not kind of guaranteed that they'll come together for, the kind of end goal of the improvement of the student experience, actually.
I was interested to find out a little bit more about your £4 million Learning Gain pilot project that I believe you helped assess or had some involvement with.
Yes, so I was evaluating the pilot projects.
Yes, and so what were your kind of takeaways from that?
Well, it became a very political process, and I think because they actually didn't address the questions of, kind of value and purpose, we're kind of trying to just find numbers.
Right.
And ideally numbers that could just kind of go in a box in the TEF. And when it became not that easy, it was kind of something then, rather than take a stand and say, this is actually what we value and what we think purposes are and the direction we want to go in, they kind of shelved the project. And instead are actually focusing on just adding to the NSS, which means instead of getting better data about students' learning and value for money, we're just learning more about student satisfaction.
I think that's super interesting because there's a question from the lady there, I think it was at the University of Hertfordshire, and her point was, how do we keep the human element around all of this? And you and I were talking, Simon, about, you have slow food and you have slow business, and perhaps we're evolving with the use of data. And we'll get that kind of cultural point around, it's not black and white, and perhaps it's kind of learning to interpret it, isn't it, as well?
Yeah. I think that's right. And something that was interesting that came out of another discussion I was involved in earlier is that the sector feels that the Learning Gain pilot was extremely valuable, actually, and has some really valuable lessons to learn there about how we can improve student attainment, and we shouldn't lose that valuable kind of exercise, and even if it's not going to be rolled out into kind of something more sector-wide, because like you made the point that you made in the discussion, it is possible to measure things if it's thought about carefully. You know, we shouldn't just kind of bury our heads in the sand and go, we can't do it, it's not possible.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a huge irony in the approach that OFS is taking. Is they're a market regulator trying to drive competition in the sector, but then they're holding all institutions to account for the same data, which means no one's allowed to specialize, become distinctive, which is the whole point of a market. And I think what you actually want are institutions to compete in different spaces, so that, you know, for example, in the US, you can be a really good liberal arts college, and you're not trying to be a research-intensive institution. You're trying to be the best liberal arts college you can. Whereas in the UK, you know, conservatoires and, you know, are held to account for the same thing as red brick institutions. And they're not fair comparisons, actually. And they're not allowing institutions to be distinct and distinctive and you know, kind of showcase the ways that they're special and, you know, to recruit students who want a distinctive special experience. So I think there's some logic there in kind of how OFS is using data in kind of a one-size-fits-all way, and how do we, you know, think of data more broadly, which would ironically actually fit this mission of a competitive market.
Value, yeah.
And I think that's interesting because it's also what the keynote speaker talked about, Kevin Fong, earlier, right? When he was talking about, you know, the competitive environment has changed, the landscape overall has changed so quickly. But then how does a university really find what is distinctive about themselves? And with this competition, whether it's in America or here or globally, you know, students are looking more internationally at those schools. So they have to be more distinctive. And it's interesting because I've often said, you know, the terms, well, finding the right student, it's almost seen as, oh, well, that's a bad thing. But actually, not everybody is set up for the right institution. You want to make sure that you're setting your students up to succeed. You know, if they go in studying one thing, maybe that's not right for them, you know, and how do you be more proactive in thinking about that? And they want this more, I think, traditional, you know, consumer experience. Well, how are you set up to be able to do that? And how can data lead for that conversation? And I think we often think of data can be a bad word, but it's actually how do you use it to be more innovative on your campus, you know, to be delivering across the board.
There's 2 points there. Like, one, in defence of data, is the room next door was talking about diversity in higher education, which was our last episode. We looked at that. And so data can be a sort of driving point or starting point for action. You know, if you're starting to collect and measure things and actually say, well, you know, this has not changed, then let's do something about it. But contrary to that was Kevin Fong's point about if he was sort of a data statistic now or data set, you know, he wouldn't be the one getting into some of the top universities in London, yet, you know, he's been really successful. So if you look at it on paper, you know, he wouldn't get entered necessarily, but actually he's got all the assets that are needed to kind of thrive and survive. So it's kind of like making sure we're aware of our data blind spots as well a little bit.
Well, I think about also not letting data be the driver. So, I mean, I think that what Kevin was talking about is things like admissions can become you just add up tariff points and then you either you're in the in basket or the out basket. And, you know, and there's no contextualization or understanding or getting to know students. And of course, you know, there's a lot of unfairness in things like interviews, but it does allow students with, you know, different qualifications coming in to maybe, you know, shine a bit and get a place that, you know, maybe they'll do very well with. And I think that's, you know, kind of how you use data. And I think actually being, you know, completely data-led could actually be to the detriment of individuals.
Having that human element involved as well.
I think a really good example of this is how you measure something that you're trying to improve, and then it just changes what you're trying to do. Is when the way that universities measure disadvantage in the UK from students is one of my pet peeves, actually. So basically we measure it based on a neighbourhood area where we've looked at the number of people from that area have gone to university, and everyone knows that when you look at London, it just doesn't work, because you can have like a neighbourhood of London and it will have a very high participation rate, but there will be an estate in that area where nobody goes to university. So example, isn't it? The universities, they're basically driven to kind of improve their participation rate from these areas that are supposed to be low participation. So they just will move, you know, they will go towards those areas that are lower participation, but they might necessarily not be, because another quirk of the data actually is that you might have a rural area which is low participation, but it's got a private school in it, right?
Or second homers, or
So therefore, they're all going to be so that they would have ticked their box saying we've got lots of students from that area, but actually they they're all independently educated.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I'm really upset. The TEF metrics at a lot of institutions might cover about 20% of the student body. They don't cover postgraduate students. They don't cover international students. And when you an institution like Imperial, we have 50% international students, and they're not counted for in any of the outcome metrics. And so you're dismissing so many students when you look at that. And that's something I've actually given lectures to on courses for aspiring governors, to say you can't just use these data sets that the regulators kind of ask for, because they don't actually account for the students at that institution. So you need to push back, and what I say is your responsibility as governor is to all the students at that institution, not just to the regulators who kind of cherry pick a certain segment that they hold the institution to account for.
Well, so this leads me on to my next question is, how are universities making sense of data? Who is the interpreter? And I've put data protection officer, whole senior leadership team, ? Or external partners, people like Data HE, HESA. Any thoughts on, how do people make sense of that? There's so many stakeholders involved.
I suppose, this comes back to what you're using data for, really, in a way. One of the two major holders of data, I suppose, that we look at for THE when it comes to the UK is UCAS and HESA. But they've both got very different roles. UCAS is a very sort of kind of market that is their governance as well. So UCAS's role is really about admissions, and that's a competitive market, right? And HESA is much more about giving you background and context about the sector as a whole. So it's about they have different missions, and therefore the data is produced in different ways. They actually have completely different IDs for the institutions and things. There's sometimes not, and I think Paul was talking about this, you need this integration between the two of them. Right. And something that came out of a session I was chairing earlier was that do we need, say, for example, a unique learner number in HE that can help us kind of, it sounds a little bit kind of Orwellian, but do we need to give, does each individual student, even from the time when they're at school, do we need a number so that all these things marry up? Everyone knows who they're talking about in terms of the data. You have strict rules around privacy, obviously, but then that would help to kind of integrate those systems. I mean, I don't know what other people think of that.
As Orwellian as it seems, it is being talked about on some level. And how do you, kind of as the learner, actually own your profile, and then you can give the permission on the data that you want, but that you can also share it so that as you enter a university, that they are able to better understand who you are, and making sure from the onset that onboarding experience is more tailored and relevant, that you even have the support from day one that you might need, across the institution. And I think it is around, how, and one gentleman said, we're actually drowning in data. There's actually so much data that you're right, and there's so many different stakeholders. It's not just how do you make sense of this, but how do you almost have that structure? How do you create a governance model on your campus so that you can think about this, and you're giving the right information to the relevant individuals at the right time? At the same time, not everybody needs access to all of the data, but you do need that, culture of data, going up and going down across the university. And I think sometimes the student gets lost in the mix of this, and not thinking of them as just, they're amalgamation of many different data points, but what does this actually mean? And being able to pull up to that strategic view of, how does this align to the mission, the vision, asking those right questions, but also, challenging it across the institutions and across, the entire sector to say, is this what we need? Is this right? Is this the data that we have? And how do we move forward from there?
I think a challenge within universities is it's often the external facing people who have the data and access the data because they need to. They have to report back to HESA and to the OFS and work with the UCAS data coming in. And it's that translation job to the individuals within the institution. And it's not helped by things like the regulator pushing for something like subject TEF that doesn't actually align with the courses that students take. So again, then you get data clumped in ways that isn't relevant for individual students because it's compiling data across a whole bunch of faculties that for most students that never encounter. So what's the point of this amalgamated data? So then how does that then get translated again into the relevant level to help teachers actually understand the students that they are teaching? Because that's the data they need, not kind of general data about some students somewhere. And I think that's the challenge within institutions to kind of map the data to the relevant party and have them actually then see what they're doing.
Another person I wanted to ask about interpreting data for universities was Paul Clarke, the Chief Executive at HESA, or the Higher Education Statistics Agency. Here's what he said when we caught up on the phone this week.
Okay, so I think there's a distinction between the people who run universities and the people who contribute research for university activity. So in terms of the first, obviously the strategic planners and the registrars and others are our primary customers, primary users of the data, and they're the ones who are charged with bringing all the data together from various sources, making sense of it, and then using it to inform decision making at senior level in institutions. So they have this responsibility. They are the most data literate and data hungry of our customers, and increasingly they're wanting to draw together data from many different sources in order to be able to navigate their way through what is an increasingly complex environment. So strategically, I would say they were the biggest audience and those who are making most use of it. But also just a couple of other groups. Secondly, there are those who are sort of charged with more operational responsibility for running different aspects of the university, and data is coming in much more pervasively to every single area of university activity. So it's not just about the administration or the finances or the strategy. It's actually about the core activities of teaching, research, and student support. So in addition to administrators, there are academics, lecturers, researchers, and students themselves, I think, who are making much, much more use of data now. And I think the sector as a whole is at the beginning of this journey, and there's a long way to go, but the possibilities are really exciting, and there's some really fantastic examples of doing this in the sector. Yeah, so in my experience, there are a couple of universities who do a really fantastic job of putting together their own academic expertise in data science with their administrative capability to create a really fantastic infrastructure that can particularly support student learning and progression, and also student welfare and health and well-being. And it does provide that kind of individualized, tailored service that is spoken about in other areas. And there are not many examples of this yet, I don't think, but there are a small number of highly effective examples. And I think that is quite exciting. And when I talk to the people who are involved in this kind of work, there's initially some challenge in getting the academics and the students on board with it. But once they see the benefits, everybody gets behind it, then I think the potential is really significant, because it really does support students who may otherwise be facing difficulty. They want very rapid feedback. They get it in other areas of their lives, so why shouldn't they get it at university, particularly when many more young people are going to university than ever before? And that relies not just on data, but it's a very data-hungry service. And I think, again, that putting these items together from different sources and feeding them through really sort of insightful and accessible digital technology is a really fantastic set of developments. It needs to be scaled up in the sector, in my view.
Well, a quick one. I mean, if I understand correctly, you held various positions within universities before sort of perhaps going into data specialism. And I just wondered, for those people listening who sort of see that, this is a critical area within the running of a university, what kind of professional development opportunities are there, and what should they be looking out for in order to better understand and use this to their benefit?
Well, I'd say two things. One is that are quite broad. One is an understanding of digital transformation, how digital services work, how they can be integrated into university operations and systems. There are particular approaches that you would apply if you want to digitize something, and I think that again, we're at the start of that journey. So there's more to be done on that. And I think the second thing is statistical literacy. So you put those two things together, so people have got an understanding of numbers and the techniques to combine lots of really sizable data sets together in a way that produces meaningful insights and is done in a literate way, You combine that with understanding of how to channel things through new digital services. I think that's a hugely powerful combination. And anybody who's got that skill set is going to be highly in demand in the university sector.
Fantastic. And then just one final one. I noticed it mentioned cybersecurity in your bio.
Yeah.
And I saw something, I can't remember if it was JISC or someone that was sharing a project where universities were sort of stress testing each other's data security protocols. And I just wondered if more broadly there was an opportunity for universities to work together, test each other's work out.
Definitely, yeah. So not in this role, in a previous role, did work with the government, with the Cabinet Office and with others when they were launching their cybersecurity initiative, and sort of a liaise between the government and the university sector to raise awareness around cybersecurity and to understand the particular challenges that universities face. And as part of that process, we set up some forums where university practitioners in cybersecurity could discuss with one another the kind of threats that they were seeing and the things that they were facing, so that they could learn from the experience of others and take action. And that was a combination of university sort of IT, heads of IT, chief information officers, but also, again, academics who working in academic departments in universities on cybersecurity, of which there are a number of really excellent departments in this country. And I think bringing together that academic expertise with the IT people, the IT staff who were responsible for leading this area in an area which was genuinely new and uncertain, I think was a really powerful combination. And all that's happened since that time, as a few years ago now, is that the number of threats have just increased exponentially. So it's ever more important that those forums exist, and I no doubt that they're still continuing to be used. And I know this is something that the government continues to have an interest in and engage with the sector on.
Thanks, Paul. And now back to our chat.
Well, that brings me on to my point. But Simon, we went through a golden age of infographics a few years back, and now it's all about the dashboard. And of course, league tables. What's your approach with making sense of data for universities? So how can we make that exact complicated situation we just discussed more simple?
My approach, literally as a journalist trying to make sense of data on higher education, to ask the question first. I think that's kind of what came out of the session today. What do I want to know? Why do I want to know it? And then look for the data, and then always bear in mind context. Always, at every point, think about the caveats to what you're looking at. Think about what it doesn't include. Think about where it might be wrong. They're kind of golden rules that I always have. And I think then you can't go far wrong. And I think it's all about communicating caveats as well. Mm-hmm. So if you're writing about data or you're trying to explain data, say, you know what, I always try and start this whenever I write an article, or at least a longer article. This isn't perfect. What we've tried to do here, it doesn't measure everything. It might even have unintended consequences and be wrong in some places, but we're trying our best. And I think that's actually an approach that goes along with in the rankings as well, certainly.
So I started my career actually in recruitment and admissions working for a university, and it used to be very frustrating because there were the equivalents of the rankings or the league tables, and people would come and say, well, you are not ranked high enough, right? Well, they're looking at a certain set of data, and I fully respect that that's the case, that there might be out there, but there has to be, and we talked about this before, it's still that human element, right? Still, how do you interpret it? And is this right for you? I mean, how do you use the right data, to personalize it for your own experience? Right? You can look at all of this, but at the same time, it still has to be, thought-provoking, asking the right questions, still understanding what do you want to gain, for instance, from that university experience. That it might be the best research university, but if you have no desire to do research, then that's not going to be the right place for you. If you have no desire to study one topic, then you need to figure out what is the right place for you. So asking those questions and finding it relevant.
I actually think students are pretty savvy on this front. When you talk to students about how they use things like league tables, they don't just open it up and see who's at number one and say, 1 to 5, that was my UCAS, kind of form. A lot of students that you talk to them, and it doesn't actually match the way a lot of universities act like students would use the data. So I think it is providing, data in lots of formats, lots of different kind of data, so that people can make informed choices. I mean, I've talked to a lot of students who kind of walked me through their college decision-making process, in different research projects I've done. And it was things like, I kind of want to study marine biology. Then I looked at the courses that did marine biology. Then I looked at my grades and saw which ones I could get into. And then there were like 4 left, and, I had to look at them, and this one was rated the highest, of my options. And so they tend to look at it much more nuanced ways. I mean, especially domestic students. International, it can be a bit different.
Yes.
But especially for domestic students, it isn't this just kind of, the rankings drive what they're doing. They'll use, and then they'll be like, I went and looked at that institution. It was just like a concrete jungle. I couldn't see myself there. Or it was too close to home, or too close to my boyfriend, or not far enough away.
Well, and there's so much more data as well besides the league tables, right? I mean, the chat rooms that they have with each other that is going and, analyzing, well, what is it really like on this campus? I mean, we talk about data. There's data in so many different formats now, which is very different than when some of us might have gone to university.
Yeah, and I think actually understanding how students use the data is, really interesting, because that actually provides a bit more insight into, what's useful and what's not. And how does it factor into decision making? And then talking to students and be like, well, and did it, was it then helpful? Or do you wish you'd kind of known something else?
Yeah, I was interviewing someone a couple of weeks back, and they were talking about, the league tables don't account for what is the sort of demographic mix of the student population in terms of their backgrounds, and am I going to fit in, and that kind of thing, which I think is quite interesting as well.
Well, and for a lot of students, that could be a very course-based feeling, because there's a lot of large institutions that have certain courses that might be very diverse. And you walk in another classroom and you're looking at a sea of the same faces. So it's very difficult, because you kind of need that data nuance. It doesn't matter that there's a whole bunch of, students who might fit a certain background, but if they're on a different campus studying different subjects, that's not going to make a difference to your own experience. So I think for students, that data, it has to be at the relevant level to kind of say, in my day-to-day classroom experience, is it going to kind of reflect the environment I want to be in? Not, is there a whole nother diverse faculty that actually isn't sitting in my class?
Which is a perfect example of the data versus the lived experience, isn't it?
Yeah. I was just going to say, and we're talking about really right now is very much the physical campus, right? But there's increasingly the online schools, right? And what does that look like, and what data do they have? And that's a totally different experience. A topic for another time, I think.
At this point, I was keen to hear about the role of data in world-class research. During the time of our recording, David Price, Vice Provost of Research at UCL, had to dash to another session, but he's kindly spent part of his weekend sending in his thoughts. I asked him, how can we make sure that the tail doesn't wag the dog? I.e., with REF and other frameworks, there's a risk that our measurement of citations drives increased focus on commercial research tied explicitly to funding, as opposed to an idea of liberal education as open-ended and exploratory. So how do we protect university from being measured to death and make sure that the data is to the university's power? And here is what he said.
The impact of the REF has, I think, been a very positive thing for British research. It focuses on quality over quantity. So we only have to submit 2.5 outputs per person in the REF process, and that covers a 7-year period. That can't really be seen to be excessively demanding. Likewise, citations are only used by some of the science areas as a guide to some of the impact of the research. It's not driven by metrics. And finally, REF is actually now requiring researchers to make their work available by open access. And this is a global good because it spreads the dissemination of knowledge as quickly and as widely as possible. When it comes to research in universities, we should be driven by questions, not by data. So it's important to frame the questions one wishes to answer with care. There is a danger, if you don't, that one becomes what one measures. So data must be used with caution. In research, we must also consider data on research and research data. These are two different things. Data on research tends to focus on things like research grant income, the number of research papers published, or the number of citations. This data and comparing it is most useful when looking at similar course scale institutions like universities or faculties. It's often misleading and should not be done to assess the achievements of an individual researcher. That approach falls foul of the San Francisco Declaration on Research Appraisal, which the Research England and UKRI are signed up to. Turning to research data, this is being generated in ever-increasing volumes at universities. Often, funders require this data to be curated and preserved. Indeed, many universities are now committed to an open data policy, which requires them to develop institutional research depositories and staff to develop and maintain the metadata that's needed by third-party users if the data is to be useful. In the future, these data sets will be certainly used by AI systems and other techniques, and we'll just have to be careful that they are not abused by such systems. I fear there will be no escaping data in the future of any university, but we must remember it needs to be used with care and with responsibility.
Thanks, David. And now back to our room at the THE Live.
Conscious of time, so 2 really final questions, but very quick answers. So I've put, sometimes when you have an argument, you walk away and then the killer line comes into your head that you wish you had said. In a slight comparison, did any of you run out of time in the panel but have additional points on data you wanted to share? Or Simon, did you have any other questions or angles you would have loved to ask? So any final points, basically?
I suppose if I was going to ask a question further, I've pretty much got in most of the questions I was going to ask. But if I was going to ask one more, it would be something along the lines of: is there anything in higher education we should never try and measure with data? And I'm not sure if I've put you on the spot.
We'll just leave that one for our
Yes.
listeners to mull over.
Yes.
Any other final points or points that you'd love to kind of round off with?
I think my thought was kind of how do we actually use data to integrate some of the different purposes of higher education a bit more. So David talked about data in terms of research, and I talked about it in terms of teaching, but how do we use data to kind of link teaching and research a bit more and get academics to think about teaching the way they might think about their research, and use that evidence, in ways that academics might be comfortable in one sphere and less comfortable in another. So I think there's a bit more how do we be more creative with bringing the different missions of the university together rather than isolating them out, because everyone becomes kind of its own data point.
One thing I was going to ask, actually, because of the learning gain pilots, do you think there'll be a time in the next 20 years where we can compare universities across the world on teaching through learning gain? Do you think that'll ever happen?
In a way, I think there's a lot that will be able to be compared. But I don't think it would ever be able to be comprehensive, because I think in different societies, higher education fits into societal structures in different ways. Yeah. When we talked, I was at an international panel with some German academics, and when we talked about employability being the obsession of UK higher education, they were completely gobsmacked because they track students early on. Yeah. So the point of university education is not employability. They were like, well, that's...
Yeah.
They kind of have
they couldn't believe we hadn't even thought of that.
Well, they have jobs matched out to different sectors of education. So it's not that there's then this free-for-all employability at the end of university study. So if you think, how would we ever agree on what higher education's for? If you said, well, not employability in Britain, and then, what's it like in the German system? I don't think we'll agree on that front. But I think we can get a lot better about capturing student outcomes from learning, effective learning processes. How do we use what we know from innovations and pedagogy to better capture, how do we teach well? How do students learn most effectively? How do we tailor education? I think we've got a lot of room for improvement in that space.
Yeah, and I think it's, and I touched on this a bit before, but data and innovation. But just to Camille, your point, I think data actually provides this opportunity to start linking up across the campus. So we talked about how it can be in these siloed systems. It's learning, it's research, it's VCs, it's deans. Well, actually, how do you start to use the data to link everything together and break down those silos across the institution, and then start to align that more with the vision and the insights and be more proactive, as you said, kind of at the initial of our conversation. I think that's really an opportunity for us.
Brilliant. Okay, final question. Not really a question. We always ask our podcast guests what people, projects, books or other resources inspire them. On the subjects of higher ed and data, any suggestions you'd like to throw in the ring for people wanting to dig in a bit more?
I loved an article I read by Nick Cohen, I think that was the name, on who does what work for. And it was so insightful on the kind of well-intentions of policymakers to get data that then they can say definitively this data says what works, and how that completely does not work for what it's designed to do, which is improve the experience of students.
Great
so yeah, that's one I would vote for.
So the one that came to mind, which isn't per se on the industry or on data, but I do think it's an interesting framework, is the book Originals by Adam Grant, which I think is just an interesting way when we're thinking about topics overall to think about it from many different angles.
Okay.
And I suppose the one thing that came to mind, because it helped me with a project recently, is there is an amazing resource online called Our World in Data, which is a project of some academics at Oxford, I believe. And they've basically, we talk about integrating data sets, right? So they have integrated lots of data sets into a bunch of really amazing, interesting infographics, interactive ones that you can look at for education, for health, for science, all sorts of things on one website. I recommend people go and have a look.
And so for anyone listening, Simon has his face looks like a sort of child in a sweet shop. But, he thought of that. So anyone else who loves data or infographics or digging into things, go and have a look at that. And just to round off, thank you all so much for sticking around for this recording, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Very much. Thanks.
That's all for this week. I hope you've enjoyed this recording about the possibilities of data and all we should consider as we work in and around it. Thanks so much for listening in, and huge thank you to all of my guests and salesforce.org for supporting. You can continue the conversation online at #EdTechPodcast, at Podcast Edtech, and at Salesforce.org on all the social medias. Or for all the show notes, including resource and reading recommendations, it's www.edtechpodcast.com. Have a great week. Bye-bye.